In 1989, 4 cousins vanished without a trace during a family Christmas gathering in rural Montana, leaving behind only their half-eaten cookies and a locked basement door. For 34 years, their disappearance remained an unsolved mystery that tore a family apart. But when a demolition crew breaks through the foundation of the old family farmhouse in December 2023, they discover something that changes everything: a hidden room that was never supposed to be found, and evidence that suggests the cousins never left the property at all. What happened on that Christmas night? And why did someone go to such lengths to bury the truth? If you're fascinated by cold cases and true crime mysteries, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into cases that have haunted families for decades. The snow fell softly on Christmas Eve 1989, blanketing the Morrison family farmhouse in a pristine white that made everything look peaceful, untouched. Inside, the warmth of the wood-burning stove filled the living room, where 17 family members had gathered for their annual celebration. The adults clustered around the dining table, their voices rising in cheerful debate over politics and football, while the children darted between rooms in excited chaos. 4 cousins, Sarah Morrison, age 12, her brother David, age 10, and their cousins Amanda and Christopher Wells, ages 11 and 9, had claimed the basement as their territory. They descended the wooden stairs with flashlights and a plate of sugar cookies, giggling about the ghost stories they planned to tell in the darkness below. Sarah's mother, Catherine, remembered calling down to them around 8:30. "Don't make a mess down there, and stay away from your grandfather's workshop." "We will," Sarah's voice had echoed back up the stairs, bright and unconcerned. That was the last time anyone heard from the 4 children. When Catherine went to check on them at 9:15, she found the basement empty. The plate of cookies sat on an old trunk, half-eaten. The flashlights were scattered across the floor, still on, their beams cutting through the dusty air. The door to their grandfather's workshop stood open, something the children had been explicitly forbidden from entering. But the children themselves were gone. The family searched the basement frantically, then the entire house, then the barn and outbuildings. They called the children's names until their voices went hoarse. By 10 o'clock, someone had called the sheriff. By midnight, search parties were combing through the snowy fields surrounding the property. They found no footprints leading away from the house, no signs of struggle, no evidence that the children had ever left the basement. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. The case consumed the Morrison family and the small town of Clearwater, Montana. Investigators interviewed every family member, every neighbor, every delivery driver who had passed through the area. They searched the woods, dragged the nearby creek, and excavated portions of the property. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Psychics offered their services. The FBI opened a file that would span thousands of pages over the decades. But they never found the children. Not a single trace. The family fractured under the weight of suspicion and grief. Catherine and her husband Michael divorced within 2 years. Amanda and Christopher's parents, Ellen and Robert Wells, left Montana and never returned. The farmhouse, once filled with laughter and warmth, stood empty for years before Catherine's father, old Thomas Morrison, moved back in alone, unable to let go of the place where his grandchildren had vanished. Thomas died in 2019, leaving the property to Catherine, who couldn't bring herself to visit it, let alone live there. The house deteriorated through 4 more winters, until Catherine finally made the decision to have it demolished in December 2023. The demolition crew arrived on a gray morning, exactly 34 years after the children disappeared. By noon, they had reduced most of the structure to rubble. But when they began working on the basement, their excavator struck something unexpected: a concrete wall that didn't appear on any of the original building plans. Behind that wall, they found a room that had been sealed shut for over 3 decades. And inside that room, They found answers that would prove more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Detective Rebecca Torres stood at the edge of the excavation site, her breath forming small clouds in the December cold. The demolition had stopped 3 hours ago when the crew chief called 911, and now the entire property was cordoned off with yellow tape that snapped and fluttered in the wind. She had been with the Montana State Police for 15 years, but she had never worked the Morrison case. She'd been too young when it happened, just a child herself in 1989. Now, looking down at the exposed hidden room in the basement, she felt the weight of 3 decades pressing against her chest. "Detective Torres?" A young officer approached, his face pale despite the cold. "The ME is here, and, Captain wants you to know that Catherine Morrison is on her way. She insisted on coming." Rebecca nodded, pulling her coat tighter. "Keep the perimeter secure. I don't want anyone down there who doesn't need to be." She turned to face the officer directly. "And I want every piece of evidence photographed and documented before anything gets moved. This is going to be examined under a microscope." She made her way carefully down the debris-strewn basement stairs, which were somehow still intact despite the demolition. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chen, was already crouched near the opening in the concrete wall, shining her flashlight into the darkness beyond. "What do we have?" Rebecca asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Patricia looked up, and Rebecca saw something, haunted in her expression. 4 bodies. Children, based on preliminary observation. They've been here a long time. Rebecca felt her stomach clench. She'd known, of course, what they would find, but knowing and seeing were different things. She moved closer to the opening, careful not to disturb anything, and directed her own flashlight into the hidden room. It was roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, the walls bare concrete. 4 small forms lay on the floor in what had once been sleeping bags, now deteriorated with age. The room had been sealed so completely that the bodies had mummified rather than decomposed, preserved by the dry air and constant temperature. But it was what else was in the room that made Rebecca's blood run cold. Food wrappers and empty water bottles were scattered across the floor. A battery-powered lantern sat in one corner, long dead. And on the far wall, scratched into the concrete with something sharp, were words written in a child's uneven handwriting. "We tried to get out. Please find us." "Jesus Christ," Patricia whispered beside her. "They were alive in here. Sealed in alive." Rebecca's mind raced through the implications. The children hadn't been killed on Christmas Eve. They'd been trapped in this room, hidden behind a false wall while their family searched frantically above. They'd survived for days, maybe longer, slowly dying of dehydration or starvation while rescue was impossibly close. "Who would do this?" Patricia asked, though it wasn't really a question that expected an answer. Who could seal 4 children in a room and leave them to die? "Someone who was at the Christmas gathering," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the horror churning in her gut. "Someone who had access to the basement, who knew the layout of the house well enough to create this hiding place without anyone knowing." She turned away from the opening, pulling out her phone. "I need the original case files. Every interview, every statement, every piece of evidence collected in 1989. And I need a complete list of everyone who was at that Christmas Eve gathering." As she climbed back up the basement stairs to make her calls, she heard a commotion outside. Through the broken windows of what had once been the living room, she could see a woman in her 60s being held back by officers at the perimeter tape. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see the raw anguish on her face. Catherine Morrison had arrived. Rebecca steeled herself and walked outside, nodding to the officers to let Catherine through. The woman stumbled forward, her eyes locked on the farmhouse ruins, and Rebecca caught her arm to steady her. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Detective Rebecca Torres. I'm so sorry, but I need you to stay back from the scene. We're processing evidence." Catherine's eyes, red-rimmed and desperate, found Rebecca's face. "Is it them? Is it my babies?" Rebecca hesitated, then decided the woman deserved the truth. "We've found 4 bodies in a hidden room in the basement. We believe they're your children and your niece and nephew. I'm so very sorry." Catherine's knees buckled, and Rebecca supported her weight as the woman sobbed against her shoulder. 34 years, Catherine choked out. 34 years I've been looking for them. 34 years wondering if they were alive somewhere, if they'd been taken, if they hated me for not protecting them. Rebecca guided her to a patrol car where she could sit down. "Mrs. Morrison, I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions. About that Christmas Eve, about the people who were there." Catherine wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "I've told the story so many times. To the police, to the FBI, to reporters. I've relived that night in my head every single day for 34 years. "I know," Rebecca said gently, "but I need you to tell me again. Because someone at that gathering is responsible for this. Someone sealed those children in that room and watched your family search for them. Someone attended their memorial services and lived with this secret for over 3 decades. Catherine's expression hardened, grief transforming into something else. A fierce, cold determination. "Then let's find the monster who did this to my children." The Montana State Police field office in Clearwater had been transformed into a command center within hours. Maps of the Morrison property covered one wall, while photographs from the 1989 investigation filled another. Rebecca stood before a whiteboard where she'd written the names of every person who had been present at the Christmas Eve gathering. 17 people total. 4 children who died. 13 adults who survived, though 8 of them were now deceased themselves, claimed by age and illness over the decades. That left 5 living witnesses, 5 people who had been there that night, and might hold the key to what happened. Her partner, Detective Marcus Chen, no relation to the medical examiner, sat at a desk surrounded by boxes of old case files. He'd been reading for hours, occasionally making notes or flagging particular documents. "The original investigators were thorough," Marcus said, looking up from a thick folder. "They questioned everyone multiple times, ran background checks, looked for any history of child abuse or violence. They found nothing." Rebecca studied the names on the board. Catherine Morrison, mother of Sarah and David. Michael Morrison, father. Ellen Wells, mother of Amanda. Robert Wells, father of Christopher. Thomas Morrison, grandfather, owner of the house. Dorothy Morrison, grandmother. Frank Morrison, Thomas's brother. Margaret Morrison, Frank's wife. Paul Morrison, Thomas's other son, uncle to the children. Linda Morrison, Paul's wife. Gregory Morrison, Thomas's nephew. Susan Morrison, Gregory's wife. James Hartley, family friend invited by Thomas. 17 people, Marcus repeated, and according to every statement, none of them left the main floor or upstairs during the time the children were in the basement. Everyone was accounted for. "Except that's impossible," Rebecca said. "Someone had to have built that room. Someone had to have sealed the children inside. That required time, materials, knowledge of the house's structure." She tapped the whiteboard. "Whoever did this had been planning it. That room wasn't constructed on Christmas Eve. It was built beforehand, waiting." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "So we're looking for someone who had extended access to the house before Christmas. Someone who could work in the basement without arousing suspicion." "Thomas Morrison owned the house," Rebecca said. "He lived there year-round. Anyone else would have needed a reason to be there regularly." She pulled up the background files on Thomas Morrison. The man had been 62 years old in 1989, a retired carpenter who had built the farmhouse himself in 1947. He'd been interviewed extensively, had cooperated fully with the investigation, and had seemed genuinely devastated by his grandchildren's disappearance. He'd passed a polygraph test. Nothing in his history suggested he was capable of harming children. But he was a carpenter. He would have had the skills to build a hidden room. "What about the workshop?" Rebecca asked suddenly. "The children's grandfather's workshop that they weren't supposed to go into. What was in there?" Marcus flipped through files until he found the inventory. Standard workshop tools, table saw, drill press, various hand tools. The investigators photographed everything. They noted that some of the tools appeared to have been recently used. Sawdust on the floor, that sort of thing. But Thomas said he'd been working on repair projects around the house in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Rebecca felt something click into place. Repair projects in the weeks before Christmas. She moved closer to the wall of photographs, finding the images of the basement from 1989. "Look at the walls. Do any of them look newer than the others?" Marcus joined her, studying the black and white photographs. After a moment, he pointed to the far wall of the basement, the one where the hidden room had been discovered. "That wall. The concrete looks slightly different. Cleaner, maybe. Less weathering." "Because it was newer," Rebecca said. "Thomas Morrison told investigators he'd been doing repair work. What if he wasn't repairing? What if he was building? Building a room that wouldn't be discovered unless someone knew to look for it." "But why?" Marcus asked. "Thomas Morrison had no history of violence, no criminal record, no red flags at all. And by all accounts, he adored his grandchildren. Why would he build a death trap for them?" Rebecca stared at the photographs, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't make sense. Maybe he didn't build it for them specifically. Maybe he built it for another purpose, and something went wrong on Christmas Eve. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Chen. The message was brief. "Preliminary exam complete. You need to see this. Coming to field office now." 20 minutes later, Patricia arrived with a tablet containing digital photographs of her findings. She set it on the desk, and Rebecca and Marcus gathered around as she pulled up the first image. 4 bodies, confirmed to be children based on bone structure and dentition," Patricia began. "Ages consistent with the missing Morrison and Wells children. I'll need dental records for positive identification, but I'm confident we have the right victims." "Cause of death?" Rebecca asked. "Dehydration, most likely, combined with hypothermia. The basement would have been cold in December, and there was no heating source in that sealed room." Patricia swiped to the next image. "But here's what's interesting. I found evidence of significant trauma on one of the bodies, the oldest child, based on bone development. Sarah Morrison, presumably." The image showed a skull with a distinct fracture pattern. "Blunt force trauma to the back of the head," Patricia said. "This injury occurred peri-mortem, around the time of death. It might not have been immediately fatal, but it would have caused serious concussion, possibly unconsciousness." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. "Someone hit her." "Or she fell and hit her head," Patricia said. "But given the circumstances, the former seems more likely. The impact pattern is consistent with being struck with a cylindrical object, something like a pipe or a heavy tool handle." Marcus was already pulling up the workshop inventory again. There were several heavy tools in the grandfather's workshop. Sledgehammer, various wrenches, metal pipes. "Here's the other thing," Patricia continued, swiping to another image. "I found fibers on all 4 bodies. Old, degraded, but still identifiable. Wool fibers, consistent with winter clothing. Adult-sized based on the weave pattern." She looked up at Rebecca. "Someone was in that room with the children, or at least made physical contact with them before sealing them in." "DNA?" Rebecca asked hopefully. Patricia shook her head. "After 34 years? Unlikely to get anything usable, but I'll try. The cold and dry conditions preserved the bodies, but DNA degrades over time regardless. Rebecca stood, pacing the small office. So we have 4 children who were somehow lured or forced into this hidden room. At least one of them, Sarah, was struck on the head with a heavy object. Someone wearing wool clothing made contact with them. Then they were sealed inside and left to die. The question is still who and why, Marcus said. Who would do this to children? And what possible motive could they have had? Maybe it wasn't about the children specifically, Rebecca said slowly. Maybe it was about the family, about destroying Catherine and Michael, Ellen and Robert, about inflicting the worst possible pain. She turned, back to the whiteboard, studying the names. We need to talk to the 5 surviving witnesses: Catherine Morrison, Ellen and Robert Wells, Paul Morrison and Gregory Morrison. One of them knows something, even if they don't realize it. Or one of them is the killer, Marcus added quietly. Rebecca nodded, the weight of that possibility settling over her. Or one of them is the killer. The first interview was scheduled for the following morning at Catherine Morrison's home in Billings, 3 hours from Clearwater. Rebecca and Marcus made the drive through snow-dusted highways, arriving at a modest ranch-style house in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. Catherine answered the door, looking as though she hadn't slept, her eyes hollow and distant. "Please, come in," she said, her voice hoarse. "I made coffee." They settled in her living room, surrounded by photographs that documented a life frozen in time. Pictures of Sarah and David covered every surface. School photos, birthday parties, moments of ordinary happiness that had ended 34 years ago. Rebecca noticed that there were no photographs of Catherine with anyone else. No evidence of the life she'd built after losing her children. "Mrs. Morrison," Rebecca began gently, "I need to ask you about your father. Thomas Morrison." Catherine's hands tightened around her coffee mug. "My father was a good man. He would never have hurt those children. He loved them more than anything." "I'm not accusing him," Rebecca said carefully. "But we need to understand the house, the basement, the workshop. Your father was a carpenter. He had the skills to build that hidden room." "He built the entire house," Catherine said, her voice defensive. "Every room, every wall. Of course he had the skills, but that doesn't mean he used them to hurt his grandchildren." Marcus leaned forward. "Can you think of any reason your father might have constructed a sealed room in the basement? Any purpose it could have served?" Catherine was silent for a long moment, staring into her coffee. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "There was something my father never talked about, something from before I was born." Rebecca waited, sensing they were approaching something important. "My father had a brother," Catherine continued. "Not Frank, another brother, older. His name was William. He died when my father was 17, back in 1944. The family never spoke about how William died, but I remember overhearing my grandmother once, when I was very young. She was talking to my mother, and she said something about William hurting children, about the sheriff taking him away." Marcus was already making notes. "Do you know what happened to William Morrison?" Catherine shook her head. "My father would never discuss it. I only know that William died young, and that there was some kind of scandal. My grandmother made it clear it was a subject that was forbidden." She looked up at Rebecca. "Could that be connected? Could my father have built that room as some kind of, I don't know, punishment chamber? Something related to his brother?" "We'll look into William Morrison," Rebecca said, "but I need to ask you about the other people who were at the Christmas gathering. Your ex-husband, Michael. Where is he now?" "Michael died 6 years ago. Heart attack." Catherine's expression remained carefully neutral. "We divorced in 1991. He blamed me for what happened, said I should have been watching the children more carefully, as if I could have known." "What about your brother Paul?" Paul still lives in Montana, up in Kalispell. He and Linda divorced about 10 years ago. He runs a hardware store. Catherine paused. Paul took it hard when the children disappeared. He and Sarah were especially close. She reminded him of his own daughter who had died in infancy years before. Rebecca made a mental note to follow up on that detail. And your cousin Gregory? Gregory moved to Seattle shortly after the disappearance. I haven't spoken to him in decades. He and Susan split up eventually. I heard through family gossip. But I don't know anything beyond that. What about James Hartley? Marcus asked. The family friend who was invited that Christmas Eve. Catherine frowned. James was an old friend of my father's. They served together in the Army during World War II. I didn't know him well. He'd moved to Idaho after the war and only visited occasionally. I remember he seemed uncomfortable that Christmas Eve, nervous. He left early before the children disappeared. Said he wasn't feeling well. Rebecca exchanged a glance with Marcus. He left before 9 o'clock? Around 8:45, I think. My father walked him out to his truck. Catherine set down her coffee mug, her hands shaking. Do you think James had something to do with this? We're just gathering information right now, Rebecca said. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to think carefully. In the weeks before Christmas, did you notice anything unusual about the house? Any changes to the basement? Any construction sounds? Anything out of place? Catherine closed her eyes, clearly trying to remember. I visited several times in December, bringing the children to see their grandparents. I don't remember noticing anything unusual. But I wasn't looking for anything either. The basement was always cluttered with my father's projects and stored furniture. Did the children ever mention finding anything strange in the basement? Any new rooms or spaces? No, but they didn't spend much time down there except on Christmas Eve. They thought it was creepy. Catherine's voice broke. I should have listened to them. I should have kept them upstairs with me. Rebecca reached across and touched Catherine's hand. This wasn't your fault. Someone planned this. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. You couldn't have known. They spent another hour going through Catherine's memories of that Christmas Eve. But she had no new information to offer. Everything had seemed normal until the moment the children vanished. No arguments, no strange behavior from any of the guests, no warning signs. As Rebecca and Marcus prepared to leave, Catherine walked them to the door. Detective Torres, she said quietly, when you find out who did this, when you know for certain, will you tell me before you tell the press? I need to hear it from you first. I need to understand why someone would do this to my babies. I promise, Rebecca said. They drove in silence for several miles before Marcus spoke. William Morrison, a brother who died in 1944 after allegedly hurting children. Think there's a connection? I think we need to dig into the Morrison family history, Rebecca said. Whatever happened with William, it affected Thomas deeply enough that he never spoke about it. That kind of trauma doesn't just disappear. Her phone rang. The field office. She put it on speaker. Detective Torres, we've got something. The voice of Officer Davis came through. We searched property records and found something interesting about James Hartley, the family friend who attended the Christmas gathering. What did you find? He owned property adjacent to the Morrison farm, a small cabin about half a mile through the woods from the farmhouse. He sold it in 1990, right after the disappearance. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. Is the cabin still standing? According to county records, yes. Current owner uses it as a hunting lodge, only occupies it a few weeks a year. I've got the address if you want to check it out. Send it to me, Rebecca said. We're heading there now. The Hartley cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that was barely passable in winter. Rebecca and Marcus parked their SUV at the edge of the clearing and approached on foot, their boots crunching through old snow, The cabin was small, perhaps 800 square feet, with weathered log walls and a stone chimney from which no smoke emerged. Marcus had called ahead to the current owner, a man named Derek Paulson, who lived in Missoula, and gave permission for them to search the property. He'd mentioned that the cabin was unlocked. There wasn't much inside worth stealing. Rebecca pushed open the front door, which swung inward with a groan of old hinges. The interior was sparse. A wood stove, a small table with 2 chairs, a cot in the corner. Dust covered everything, and animal droppings suggested that mice had taken up residence. It looked like exactly what it was, a hunting cabin that saw occasional use. "What are we looking for?" Marcus asked, pulling on latex gloves. "I don't know," Rebecca admitted, "but Hartley owned this place in 1989. He was at the Morrison house on Christmas Eve. He left early, right around the time the children went missing. That's too many coincidences." They searched methodically, checking drawers, looking under the cot, examining the walls for any hiding places. The cabin yielded nothing of interest. Old hunting magazines, spare ammunition, camping supplies. Rebecca was about to suggest they leave when Marcus called from the back corner. "There's a door here." Rebecca joined him. A small door, barely 4 feet high, was set into the wall near the floor. It had been painted the same color as the surrounding logs, making it nearly invisible. Marcus pulled it open, revealing a crawl space that extended under the cabin. "I'll go," Rebecca said, pulling out her flashlight. She got down on her hands and knees and crawled into the darkness, her light sweeping across dirt floor and the underside of floorboards. The space smelled of earth and decay. At the far end of the crawl space, her light caught something that made her freeze. A wooden box, roughly the size of a small chest, sat against the foundation wall. She crawled closer, her heart pounding. The box was locked with an old padlock, but the wood around the latch was rotted. Rebecca grabbed the lock and pulled hard. It came away with a shower of rust and wood fragments. She lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, black and white in color, spanning what looked like several decades. Rebecca lifted the first one, and her stomach turned. Children. Young children, bound and gagged, their eyes wide with terror. She flipped through more photos, each one more disturbing than the last. Some showed children in various states of undress. Others showed them in cramped spaces, clearly imprisoned. And then she found the photographs that connected everything. 4 children in a concrete room. Sarah, David, Amanda, and Christopher Morrison Wells huddled together in what was unmistakably the hidden room from the basement. The photos showed them at different times, some when they were clearly still alert and frightened, others when they had become weak and listless. Someone had documented their deaths. "Marcus," Rebecca called, her voice shaking. "Call for backup, and get a forensics team here. We've found something." She continued carefully through the photos, documenting each one with her phone before disturbing them. At the bottom of the box, she found a journal. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were yellowed. She opened it to the first entry, dated March 15, 1943. The handwriting was neat, controlled. "William understands what we do. Father doesn't approve, but William knows that some children need correction. He's learned from watching me. Soon he'll be old enough to help properly." Rebecca flipped through more pages, bile rising in her throat as she read descriptions of abuse masquerading as discipline, of children imprisoned in small spaces to teach them obedience. The journal writer never identified himself directly, but the entries mentioned William Morrison repeatedly, describing him as an eager student. A later entry, dated July 1944, sent chills down her spine. "William went too far with the Henderson girl. She died before we could release her. Father found out. The sheriff came. William took responsibility for everything, said he acted alone. They took him away. I'm free, but I must be more careful now. No more partners. This work is solitary. The journal entries continued sporadically through the decades. 1947. Built my new house. Included special room and basement, better hidden than the old one. Learned from William's mistakes. 1963. Local boy. Teaching him about correction. 3 days was enough. 1971. Must stop for a while. New family moving nearby, too risky. And then, December 1989. James knows. Saw him looking at Sarah with that expression. He understands, has the same interests. Invited him to Christmas. We talked in the workshop. He's weak, afraid, but I know he won't tell. We're bound by the same desires. The final entry, dated December 24th, 1989. Perfect opportunity. 4 at once. James helped seal them in, his hands shaking but willing. He left after. Couldn't watch. His weakness is his downfall. But I'll watch. I'll document. This is my masterpiece. Rebecca closed the journal, her hands trembling. Thomas Morrison, the grieving grandfather who had seemed so devastated by his grandchildren's disappearance, the pillar of the community who had cooperated fully with investigators. He had been a monster hiding in plain sight for over 4 decades. She crawled back out of the crawl space, holding the box carefully. Marcus took one look at her face and knew they'd found something terrible. It was the grandfather, she said, her voice hollow. Thomas Morrison. He'd been abusing and killing children since at least 1943, and James Hartley was involved in the Morrison children's deaths. He helped seal them in. Marcus's face went pale. Jesus Christ, that means Catherine's father. Killed her children, Rebecca finished, and lived with them, mourned with them for decades afterward. She pulled out her phone to call the field office, but Marcus touched her arm. Wait. James Hartley. If he was involved and is still alive, we need to find him before this goes public. He might run. Rebecca nodded, dialing quickly. Officer Davis, I need you to locate James Hartley. Last known address was Idaho. Find him now. Consider him dangerous and a flight risk. We have evidence connecting him to the Morrison disappearances. She hung up and looked at Marcus. We also need to inform Catherine Morrison. She deserves to know before anyone else. How do you tell someone that their father murdered their children? Marcus asked quietly. Rebecca had no answer for that. Catherine Morrison's scream echoed through her living room when Rebecca told her the truth. It was a sound of primal anguish, the kind of pain that came from the complete destruction of everything she had believed about her life. She collapsed to the floor, her body shaking with sobs so violent that Rebecca feared she might hurt herself. Rebecca knelt beside her, one hand on Catherine's shoulder, saying nothing because there were no words that could possibly help. Marcus stood by the window, his jaw clenched, giving Catherine space to process the unimaginable. My father, Catherine finally gasped between sobs. My father killed my babies. He killed them and watched me search for them. He held me while I cried. He came to their memorial service. She looked up at Rebecca with red, swollen eyes. How could he do that? How could he look at me every day knowing what he'd done? Catherine, I'm so sorry, Rebecca said, the words painfully inadequate. We found his journal. He was a deeply disturbed man who had been hurting children for decades. This started long before you were born. But they were his grandchildren, Catherine whispered. Sarah and David. He used to take them fishing. He taught Sarah how to plant a garden. He called David Little Buddy. How do you do those things and then— Her voice broke again, unable to finish. Rebecca waited until Catherine's sobs subsided into ragged breathing. There's more you need to know. James Hartley was involved. He helped your father seal the children in that room. We're working on locating him now. Catherine's expression transformed, grief giving way to something harder and colder. James was his friend. They served together in the war. She stopped, her eyes widening. Oh, God. William. My father's brother, William. The journal. Does it mention him? Yes, Rebecca said carefully. Your father wrote that William learned from watching him, that William killed a girl in 1944, but took sole responsibility and went to prison or an institution. Your father used his brother as a shield. Catherine pressed her hands against her face. My whole life has been a lie. Everything I knew about my family, about my father. He wasn't a good man who lost his grandchildren. He was a monster who murdered them. Rebecca's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Officer Davis. She stood and stepped away to answer. Tell me you found Hartley. We did, Davis said. He's in a nursing home in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Severe dementia, according to the facility. He's been there for 3 years. Rebecca felt frustration tighten in her chest. Can he communicate at all? The director says he has good days and bad days. Some days he's lucid for short periods. But even on good days, his memory is unreliable. We're coming there, Rebecca said. Don't let anyone from the press near him, and assign an officer to watch his room in case he tries to leave or someone tries to silence him. She hung up and turned back to Catherine. James Hartley is alive, but he has dementia. We're going to interview him, but I can't promise he'll be able to tell us anything useful. Catherine stood slowly, steadying herself against the couch. I want to come with you. Catherine, I don't think that's... He helped kill my children, Catherine said, her voice like steel. I have a right to... Look him in the eyes. I have a right to hear whatever he has to say. Rebecca exchanged a glance with Marcus, who gave a small nod. All right, Rebecca said. But you stay outside the room during the interview. We'll let you see him afterward if it's appropriate. The drive to Coeur d'Alene took 6 hours. Catherine sat in the back seat, staring out the window in silence. Rebecca didn't try to make conversation. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow. Sometimes the only thing you could offer someone was the space to sit with their grief. They arrived at Clearwater Pines nursing home just after 7 in the evening. The facility was modern and clean, the kind of place that cost serious money. The director, a woman named Helen Vargas, met them in her office. James Hartley came to us in 2020, Helen explained. His daughter placed him here after he was found wandering in his neighborhood, unable to remember where he lived. The dementia has progressed significantly. Some days he doesn't recognize his own daughter. We need to speak with him about events from 1989, Rebecca said. It's part of an active homicide investigation. Helen's eyebrows rose. Homicide? James? She shook her head. I find that hard to believe. He's such a gentle man. He feeds the birds, talks about his grandchildren. What does he say about his past? Marcus asked. About his time in Montana? Very little. When he's lucid, he mostly talks about the war, about his time in the army. He has a photograph of himself with another soldier that he keeps by his bed. Sometimes he talks to it, as if the man in the photo can hear him. Rebecca felt a chill. Can we see that photograph? Helen led them to James Hartley's room. The old man was asleep in his bed, thin and frail beneath the blankets. On his bedside table sat a framed black and white photograph showing 2 young soldiers in World War II uniforms, their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Rebecca recognized one of them from the photos in Catherine's house. Thomas Morrison, decades younger, but unmistakable. He talks to Thomas? Rebecca asked. Yes, Helen said. Sometimes he apologizes to him, says things like, I should have stopped you, or I was too weak. We assumed he was talking about something from the war. Marcus moved closer to the bed. Mr. Hartley. James, we need to talk to you. The old man's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with cataracts, confused and unfocused. Tom, he whispered. "Tom, is that you?" Rebecca stepped forward. "James, my name is Rebecca Torres. I'm a detective. I need to ask you about Christmas Eve, 1989, about the Morrison children." Something shifted in James's expression. Fear, guilt, shame, all flickering across his wrinkled face. "The children," he murmured. "The poor children. Tom said they needed correction. Said they'd been disobedient. But they were so small." "What happened that night, James?" Rebecca asked gently. "I helped him," James whispered, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "He showed me the room he'd built. Said the children would only be there for a few hours, just to teach them a lesson. I believed him. God help me. I wanted to believe him. I helped seal the door." "But you left before 9 o'clock, Rebecca said. "You left the party early." James nodded weakly. "I couldn't stay. Couldn't look at their mother, knowing what we'd done. Tom said he'd let them out after an hour. Said it was just discipline. I drove away. But I knew. Somewhere inside, I knew he was lying." "Why didn't you come back?" Marcus asked. "Why didn't you tell someone?" "I was afraid," James sobbed. "Tom said if I told anyone, he'd say it was all my idea, that I'd forced him to help me. Who would believe that Thomas Morrison, the respected carpenter, the war hero, could do such a thing? I was just a ranch hand from Idaho. I had no credibility." "So you stayed silent," Rebecca said, fighting to keep her voice neutral. "For 34 years, you let their families suffer, wondering what happened." "Every day," James whispered. "Every single day I've thought about those children, their faces, their screams when we sealed the door. I tried to tell myself that Tom let them out, that they ran away, that they were alive somewhere. But I knew. I've always known." Rebecca felt no sympathy for the old man in the bed. He'd been a coward, more concerned with saving himself than saving 4 children's lives. "Did Thomas Morrison kill other children? Before the Morrison cousins?" James closed his eyes. He told me stories. Over the years when we'd meet for drinks when I visited Montana, he'd hint at things, about teaching children lessons, about having special rooms. I never wanted to know the details. I pretended not to understand what he was really saying. "His brother William," Marcus said. "Did Thomas talk about him?" "William took the fall for Thomas," James said. "That's what Tom told me once when he was drunk. Said his brother loved him enough to go to prison for him. William died in an institution in 1947. Suicide, officially. But Tom used to say William was weak, that he couldn't handle the guilt." Rebecca thought of the journal entries, of William described as an eager student. Thomas Morrison had corrupted his own brother, then let him take the blame for his crimes. The depravity ran deeper than she'd imagined. "Where is Tom now?" James asked suddenly, his eyes focusing on Rebecca with unexpected clarity. "Did he finally get caught? Is he in prison?" "Thomas Morrison died in 2019, Rebecca said. "He never faced justice for what he did." James laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Of course he didn't. Tom always got away with everything. Even in death, he escapes." Rebecca stepped back from the bed, disgusted. "You'll be charged as an accessory to the murders of Sarah Morrison, David Morrison, Amanda Wells, and Christopher Wells. Given your age and medical condition, you'll likely spend what little time you have left in a secure medical facility rather than a prison. But make no mistake, James Hartley, you are a murderer." The old man turned his face away, tears streaming into his pillow. Outside in the hallway, Catherine stood with her back against the wall, her face ashen. She'd heard everything through the open door. "Catherine," Rebecca began, but Catherine held up a hand. "I heard," she said quietly. "I heard how my children died, sealed in a room by their grandfather and his coward friend, left to slowly die while I searched for them upstairs." She looked at Rebecca, and the pain in her eyes was bottomless. "Can I see him? Can I speak to James?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Catherine walked into the room. James looked up at her, and recognition sparked in his clouded eyes. "Katie? Little Katie Morrison?" "I'm not little Katie anymore," Catherine said, her voice trembling but controlled. "I'm the mother of the children you helped murder." James's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. God, Katie, I'm so sorry." "Your sorry means nothing," Catherine said. "My babies died terrified and alone because you were too much of a coward to stop my father. You lived your whole life free while I spent 34 years in hell." She leaned closer. "I hope whatever time you have left is filled with the same fear and pain my children felt in that room." She turned and walked out, her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face. The press conference 3 days later was held in the Montana State Police headquarters in Helena. Media from across the country had descended on Montana, drawn by the horrific revelation that the Morrison children had been murdered by their own grandfather. Rebecca stood at the podium, flanked by Marcus and Captain Sarah Walsh, facing a room packed with reporters and cameras. "On December 18, 2023, Rebecca began, reading from her prepared statement. "Human remains were discovered during the demolition of a farmhouse in Clearwater, Montana. These remains have been positively identified as Sarah Morrison, age 12, David Morrison, age 10, Amanda Wells, age 11, and Christopher Wells, age 9, 4 children who disappeared from that same farmhouse on Christmas Eve, 1989. The room erupted with questions, but Rebecca held up a hand. "Let me finish. Our investigation has revealed that the children were imprisoned in a hidden room in the basement and left to die. The person responsible for their deaths was Thomas Morrison, the children's grandfather and owner of the property. Mr. Morrison died in 2019 without ever being suspected in their disappearance." More shouting questions. Rebecca waited for silence. "We have also arrested James Hartley, age 97, as an accessory to these murders. Mr. Hartley helped Thomas Morrison seal the children in the room. Due to his advanced age and severe dementia, Mr. Hartley is currently in a secure medical facility awaiting trial." "Detective Torres," a reporter called out. "Are there other victims? Was Thomas Morrison a serial killer?" Rebecca had been dreading this question. "Evidence suggests that Thomas Morrison may have been responsible for the deaths or disappearances of other children over a span of several decades. We're currently investigating these connections and working with other jurisdictions to identify potential victims." She didn't mention the journal, the photographs, or the specific details of Morrison's crimes. Some things didn't need to be public knowledge, at least not yet. The families of other possible victims deserved to be notified privately first. "How did he avoid detection for so long?" another reporter asked. "Thomas Morrison was respected in his community, had no criminal record, and presented himself as a grieving grandfather," Rebecca answered. "He cooperated fully with the original investigation. He passed a polygraph test. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime because he had designed the hidden room specifically to be undetectable." "What about Catherine Morrison?" someone called. "How is she handling the news that her father killed her children?" Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Morrison is understandably devastated. She's asked for privacy during this difficult time. I won't be taking questions about her specifically." The press conference lasted another 30 minutes, with Rebecca deflecting the most invasive questions, while providing enough information to satisfy the media's hunger for details. When it was finally over, she retreated to her office, exhausted. Marcus found her there an hour later, staring at the case files that still covered her desk. "You did good out there," he said. "I feel like I need a shower," Rebecca replied. The way they talk about this case like it's entertainment. Those were real children, real families destroyed. "I know," Marcus said. He hesitated, then added, I heard from the forensics team. They finished processing the Morrison basement. They found some items hidden behind the false wall, children's clothing, jewelry, locks of hair, all from different victims, different time periods. Rebecca closed her eyes. How many? They're not sure yet. At least a dozen different children based on the variety of items. The oldest pieces date back to the 1940s. Thomas Morrison killed for over 40 years, Rebecca said slowly, and no one knew, no one suspected. Evil hides in plain sight, Marcus said. We see it in case after case. The friendly neighbor, the respected teacher, the beloved grandfather. People don't want to believe that someone they know could be capable of such horror. Rebecca gathered the files, stacking them neatly. We need to identify the other victims, give their families closure, just like we did for the Morrison and Wells families. We will, Marcus promised. But Rebecca, you need to take a break. You haven't slept properly in days. This case will still be here tomorrow. She knew he was right. But the thought of going home, of trying to sleep, felt impossible. How did you rest when you'd spent days immersed in the worst that humanity had to offer? Her phone rang. Catherine Morrison. Rebecca answered immediately. Detective Torres. Catherine's voice was steadier than Rebecca had heard it in days. I wanted to thank you for finding the truth, for giving me answers, even though those answers were more horrible than I could have imagined. You don't need to thank me, Rebecca said. Yes, I do, Catherine insisted. For 34 years, I've lived with not knowing, with wondering if my children were alive somewhere, suffering, calling for me. Now I know they're at rest. I know what happened to them. That knowledge is a gift, even if it's a terrible one. What will you do now? Rebecca asked. I'm going to bury my children, Catherine said. Finally, properly bury them. And then I'm going to work with the other families you identify. The other victims of my father. I'm going to help them get justice, or at least closure. It's the only way I can think to make something meaningful come from this nightmare. After they hung up, Rebecca sat in silence for a long moment. Then she stood, turned off her office light, and went home. The case would continue. There were other victims to identify, other families to notify, endless paperwork and legal proceedings. But tonight, she would rest. Tomorrow, she would continue the work of bringing light to the darkest places. The Morrison farmhouse had been completely demolished, the basement filled in with concrete. The property stood empty now, marked only by the crime scene tape that would remain for months. In the spring, Catherine Morrison planned to have the entire area covered with wildflowers, a memorial for her children and all the others who had suffered at her father's hands. In Coeur d'Alene, James Hartley lay in his nursing home bed, staring at the photograph of himself and Thomas Morrison. But the frame had been removed by the staff, following Rebecca's orders. James would spend his remaining days looking at nothing but blank walls, left alone with his memories and his guilt. The investigation into Thomas Morrison's other victims would eventually identify 17 children who had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances between 1943 and 1989 in areas where Morrison had lived or visited. Some cases were solved definitively. Others remained frustratingly circumstantial, the evidence lost to time. But the Morrison case, the 4 cousins who vanished on Christmas Eve, was closed. The truth had been found, terrible as it was. 4 children had been murdered by the man who should have protected them, and that man had lived out his life free and unsuspected, dying peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the sympathy of everyone who thought him a victim rather than a monster. Sometimes, Rebecca reflected, justice came too late. Sometimes the guilty escaped punishment. But at least the dead could finally rest, their stories told, their memories honored. At least there was finally truth. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve 2024, a memorial service was held in Clearwater, Montana. A small crowd gathered at the newly created Morrison Memorial Garden, a peaceful space where the farmhouse had once stood, now filled with flowering trees and stone benches. Catherine Morrison stood at the center, older and grayer, but somehow stronger than she'd been a year ago. Beside her stood Ellen and Robert Wells, reunited for the first time in decades by their shared tragedy and healing. Other families were there too. Families of children who had disappeared in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. Families who had finally received answers because of what was found in Thomas Morrison's hidden room. Rebecca Torres attended in civilian clothes, standing at the back of the crowd. She'd been invited by Catherine, who had become something unexpected over the past year. Not quite a friend, but a connection, a shared witness to the worst and best of what humans were capable of. A string quartet played softly as Catherine stepped forward to speak. She'd written her speech carefully, revised it dozens of times, determined to find the right words. "We gather here on Christmas Eve," she began, her voice clear despite the cold wind. "Not to celebrate, but to remember. To remember Sarah, David, Amanda, and Christopher. To remember all the children who suffered and died at the hands of a man we trusted." She paused, looking out at the assembled faces. "For decades, I believed my father was a good man who had been devastated by tragedy. Learning the truth about who he really was nearly destroyed me. But in this past year, I've learned something important. We are not defined by the evil done to us, or by the evil that came from our family. We are defined by how we choose to respond." Catherine gestured to the memorial garden around them. "This place is our response. This is where 4 children died in darkness and terror. Now it's a place of light, of life, of memory. The darkness doesn't win. It can't, as long as we refuse to let it." She placed 4 white roses on the central memorial stone, which bore the names and dates of the 4 cousins. Others came forward to add their own flowers, their own tributes, until the stone was covered in white and red blooms. The service ended as snow began to fall, soft and silent. People lingered, talking in small groups, sharing stories of the children they'd lost. Rebecca noticed Catherine speaking with a couple in their 70s, the parents of a boy who had disappeared in 1967, whose death had been definitively linked to Thomas Morrison through items found in his possession. As the crowd began to disperse, Catherine approached Rebecca. "Thank you for coming." "I wouldn't have missed it," Rebecca said. "This is a beautiful memorial." "It's not enough," Catherine said quietly. "Nothing will ever be enough. But it's something." She looked out at the garden, at the snow beginning to cover the ground. "Detective Torres, Rebecca, I need you to know something. I've forgiven my father." Rebecca stared at her in surprise. "Catherine?" "Not for what he did," Catherine clarified quickly. "I'll never forgive that. But I've forgiven him for being broken, for being sick in ways I can't understand. I've forgiven him so that I can be free, because holding on to that hatred was killing me, and he'd already taken enough from me. I won't let him take the rest of my life, too." Rebecca found she had no words. She simply reached out and took Catherine's hand, squeezing it gently. "The other families," Catherine continued, "they're at different places in their healing. Some are still angry, some are numb, some have found peace. There's no right way to survive something like this. But we're surviving, all of us. That's what matters." As Rebecca drove away from Clearwater that evening, she thought about justice and healing, about the long shadows that evil casts, and the resilience of those who survive it. The Morrison case would stay with her forever. The first case that had truly shown her the depths of human depravity and the heights of human strength. 4 cousins had vanished on Christmas Eve 35 years ago. They had died in darkness, in fear, in a room built by someone who should have loved them. But their story hadn't ended in that room. It had continued through the determination of investigators, the courage of witnesses, and the strength of families who refused to forget. Evil had not won. It never did. Not completely. Not as long as there were people willing to fight for truth. The snow continued to fall across Montana, covering the memorial garden in white, peaceful and clean. And in that garden, beneath the stones and flowers, 4 children finally rested, found at last, remembered at last, at peace at last. Their names would not be forgotten, their story would not be buried. And somewhere, in the quiet darkness, justice had been served.